Welcome to Engaging Theology. In this session, we're going to be thinking about the doctrine of the Incarnation, which is the study of Jesus' human and divine nature. We're very thrilled to welcome Oliver Crisp, who's a professor at Fuller Seminary in the States, and he's also attached to the Logos Institute at the University of St. Andrews. And Oliver's written extensively on this topic, so I'm really interested to hear some of the things he has to say today. So before we get into this topic, Oliver, it might just be helpful for us to think about what it was that got you interested in theology. Why have you done this as a career?
I think for me, theology raises the most fundamental questions about sort of life, the universe and everything. And to my way of thinking as a young person, as I was trying to think about my place in the world and what I should do with my life and what the point of everything was, the kinds of things that teenagers do all the time, I came to the conclusion that there was a God, and if there is a God, there's nothing more momentous or more important than trying to figure out who God is to the extent that we can, and what God would like us to do and how He would like us to live. So for me, theology raises those questions. It enables me to think about those fundamental questions that are really connected to my life as well as to my faith. And I think whether you're a person of faith or not, it seems to me that theology is asking those questions. Whether you think it's got the right answers or not is, of course, another matter.
So having studied theology for quite a long time now, how do you think theology has changed the way that you relate to God and your own faith?
I think theology has really quite profoundly shaped how I think about God and therefore how I relate to matters to do with church and God Himself and worship and things like that. It can't but change the way you think about these things, as I imagine spending a long time thinking about any subject would change how you interact with the content of that subject matter. So for me, I think theological questions have forced me to think hard and deeply about what I think about the church, what I think about worship, what I think about prayer, what I think I'm doing when I do those things, what I think Christians are doing when we do those things. And in thinking through those issues, I've come to see things like prayer and worship and interacting with God in different ways than I did before. I think I started off years ago when I was a teenager with these kind of rather inchoate, sort of confused questions in my head that I kind of wanted answered. And it's not that I haven't had those questions answered, but it's more like a kind of journey along the way. Though some of those questions anyway have been answered, other questions have opened up for me, and a lot of those other questions that have opened up have had to do with the nature of the church and what difference the things that I'm thinking about on a daily basis ought to make to the life of faith, what the life of the mind has to say to the life of faith and how those things are joined up. So it's about a kind of joined up faith that makes a difference at a practical level. And for me, theology needs to be engaged with the life of the church. And I think that in my own situation, thinking through that has made a big difference to how I approach those matters, how I approach the life of faith, how I approach the life of worship, how I approach the life of prayer. And it's led me to certain sorts of research projects that try to make that kind of connection between those two things.
Great. And a lot of what we're trying to do in these sessions is to engage those two questions together, the theological, perhaps more academic side of thinking about who God is and how we relate to God, with these practical issues of how we exist in the world, how we relate to one another, and how we worship this God. So it's really helpful to hear that has shaped your understanding and your relationship with God. So you've spent a fair amount of time in your career thinking about the doctrine of the Incarnation, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we should think a bit more about that today. So why do you think it is that God became incarnate? Why did God come down to earth as a human being?
That's really one of those $6 million questions, I think, that's right at the heart of the Christian faith. If you ask someone, what's Christianity about? I imagine one of the first things they'll say is, it's something to do with Jesus of Nazareth and something about Jesus of Nazareth being God and human and saving us and something along those lines, even if they don't have much more to say than that. So it is a really fundamental theological question. That's what's drawn me to the study of that particular issue. The answer that I would give as to why it is that God the Son becomes human in Christ is in order that we can be united to God and in order that we can somehow participate in the divine life. And it seems to me that that would be needed irrespective of whether or not human beings fell into sin and needed salvation. In other words, it seems to me that we need some kind of hub between the divine and the human in order that we can connect up to God, a bit like you might connect your laptop computer to the World Wide Web through some kind of electronic hub and the radio signals, a wireless hub that transmits those signals to and from your computer. So in a similar way, it seems to me that Christ is a kind of hub between God, which is like the World Wide Web, and us, which are like the laptop computers. And because he's an interface between both divinity and humanity, if you like, we're able to, by syncing up with him, to be united to God. And so therefore, it seems to me that you'd need an incarnation for that to be the case, even if human beings hadn't fallen into sin. It just so happens, in the world in which we do live, that human beings have fallen into sin. So that in a way, there's even more of a reason for God to become a human being, because not only do we need him to be a human being in order for us to participate and be united to God, but we also need him to come and to stand in our place in some respect, in order that he can deal with our sin and that we can be reconciled to God so that we can be united.
So one of the things that you were talking about there was how the incarnation seems to be integral to the Christian faith.
Right.
But do you think the incarnation is something which makes the Christian faith unique or different from other religions?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think that when you look at world religions, they're all seeking some way of connecting existentially with the kind of felt need that human beings have to be in relationship to something bigger than themselves, however you construe that. Of course, in some world religions like Buddhism, it's not necessarily a god or a divinity of any kind, but it's a sense of enlightenment. In some world religions, it's connection with the divine in some sense, whether that's one divinity or many divinities. In the Abrahamic faiths, that's Judaism, Islam and Christianity, for those three faiths that share a common heritage, it's about connecting to the one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and for Christians, the God of Christ as well, who we think has sent Christ in order to reconcile us to God's self. It seems to me that what Christianity has that all of the other world religions don't have is precisely this claim at the very center of the Christian faith, that Christ is both fully human and fully divine, and that this one person who is both fully human and fully divine comes down in order that he may perform some atoning action so that we can be in relationship to God. Now, that's not to disparage the other world religions and say they don't have any value or anything like that, but it's to say that there is something about the Christian faith that I think marks it out as unique. It has these fundamental claims about what God is doing in Christ that makes it something different from all the other faiths, even the ones that are closest to it, like the other two Abrahamic religions.
When I came to university as a philosophy undergrad, one of the questions that I really struggled with was how it could be that at the heart of the Christian faith, like you say, is this doctrine that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. On the face of it, that just looks like a contradiction, right? So how do we as sensible thinking students and individuals make sense of that doctrine? Or should we try and make sense of it at all?
Yeah, well, I think there's something that we can say that will help us to understand the doctrine more. I don't think we can fully explain the Incarnation any more than I think we can fully explain any of the central doctrines of the Christian faith. And the reason for that is that the central doctrines of the Christian faith have to do with God and therefore are going to be mysterious because God's infinite and we're limited. And so by our very natures, we're incapable of fully comprehending who God is. But that doesn't mean that we should therefore give up and not try to understand as much as we can. I think there are good reasons for trying to understand the faith that we've been given. As one of the great Christian theologians of years ago called Anselm of Canterbury said, he said, theology should be faith-seeking understanding. We should have this faith and then we should seek to understand it better. So I think that's what theology is about. It's about seeking to understand the faith that we've been given. And I think that we have a really good example of what we should be about in that regard with the doctrine of the Incarnation. So what can we say about the Incarnation? Well, I would say that we can say a number of different things based on what we find in the New Testament and what later Christian theologians and church councils have helped us to understand about who Christ is. The fundamental thing is this, that in Christ we have to deal with one person, a divine person, the second person of the Trinity, who takes on, in addition to his divine nature, if you like, his being divine, a human nature or being human. So he acquires, in becoming human, the qualities that make him a human being in addition to being a divine being. Now you're right, a lot of people think, isn't that contradictory? How can one person be both of these things at one and the same time? I think making a few simple distinctions will help us see that it's not a contradiction, although it might seem to be at first glance. For example, we can say this, it's one person that we're dealing with, and the claim isn't that there are two people in Christ, but one person. The stumbling block is that it looks like we've got one person who is both fully human and fully divine. And the question then is, how can you have one person who is both of those things at one and the same time? But perhaps it's something like this, that the divine person has being divine as part of who he is, and then the human aspect, as it were, the human nature rather, that he acquires, he takes up voluntarily and sort of contingently, as it were. He doesn't have to take it up into himself. A bit like perhaps the astronaut puts on the astronaut suit in order to walk into deep space, right? Suppose we have an astronaut in their spacesuit. The astronaut has to get into the spacesuit in order to tolerate the near vacuum of space. Of course, otherwise the astronaut would perish. In a similar way, in the Incarnation, what we're saying is a divine person takes on something like a spacesuit. It's obviously a more intimate connection than a spacesuit, but the human nature is like a spacesuit, in order that he can walk around, as it were, in the alien atmosphere of human beings in the material world. God's a spirit, he's not a physical body. So what happens in Christ is the astronaut-like entity that is the second person of the Trinity takes on the spacesuit-like entity that's a human nature, so that he can relate to us as one of us.
So one of the relating themes that seems to be emerging through all of these discussions is that in Christ and in God becoming human in the Incarnation, we have a different and a new way of relating to God. Right. And so I wonder what difference that makes to how we relate to God. So, I mean, one of the things that was quite popular as I was a young person were these little wristbands we used to wear that said, what would Jesus do? Right. And we used to somehow think that if we wore these wristbands, we would perhaps exemplify some of these character traits of Jesus more. So, So how do you think the Incarnation makes difference to who Jesus is as a role model for our lives?
I think it makes the world of difference. And it makes a world of difference because in Christ, we see the human face of God. And that's the kind of scandal at the heart of the Christian faith, this claim that in this particular individual, we're dealing not just with a human being, but with God himself. So if you take that scandalous claim seriously, that's got to revolutionize everything. Because as soon as we see that God is willing to not just reach down and interact with us, but to become one of us in order that he might save us, well, that has to revolutionize everything you think about God and everything you think about matters theological, because we're not then dealing with some kind of hidden divinity who's behind a cloud somewhere or far away from us that we have to somehow placate and approach in the hope that he won't be offended. So when we read the gospel narratives, one of the reasons why they are so scandalous and why they kind of upend what we think about who God is precisely because we see there this person, Jesus of Nazareth, dealing with the very people that we would have nothing to do with and bringing them within the orbit of salvation and showing us, therefore, something about the very nature of God, that God is not standoffish, not remote, but intimately involved with and intimately desirous of relationship with human beings.
So as you know, one of the things that we're trying to do in this series of videos is to try and connect some of these really important theological issues to questions that particularly students might have in how they live in their everyday lives as students.
Right.
And so continuing on from this discussion of what Jesus reveals to us about the nature of God, how do you think studying this and thinking through this can change how we live when we get up on a Monday morning? Like, how does engaging with this issue really change who we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it doesn't change who we are, something is fundamentally wrong about how we're approaching this question, it seems to me. That's how important it is. I think people want to know, if there's a God, does this God really care for who I am? Does it really make a difference to who I am? I think for people who are, even if they're not people of faith, but people who think or suspect maybe there is a God, nevertheless, their conception of God is largely of a being who's hidden from view and who seems remote from the sorts of concerns that they have in their everyday life, who doesn't seem to care. It's a God who's sort of far away out there somewhere. What we see in Christ is that that's not the case, that in fact this God is wanting to intimately relate with us as human beings. He's wanting to put us in a different relationship with him. He's wanting to deal with the thing that obstructs that relationship, namely human sin. And he's wanting not only to have us in relationship with him, but to have us united with him by means of what Christ is able to do for us. Those claims, I think, at the heart of the Christian faith, we sometimes skate over very quickly and trot them out as if, of course this is what Christians believe. We need to stop, we need to slow down, we need to pause, and we need to take those slowly. Because when we think about what those claims entail, it should revolutionize how we think about God. If we take those claims seriously, then we can't anymore think of God as this kind of hidden being behind the cloud. We can't think of God as merely the kind of the God on Mount Sinai that Moses had to deal with, as it were. Now we're dealing with a God who has reached out to us a hand of friendship. And not only that, but reaches out to embrace us and reaches out to have a relationship with us and reaches out to transform us and to offer us in his grace this wonderful and profound gift that Christ gives us. Now, if we take those things seriously, that's got to make a change to how we get up on a Monday morning and how we face the week and how we deal with the everyday tasks that we have to deal with. And if it doesn't, then that's probably because we're still stuck on Mount Sinai. We haven't actually come down from the mountain to encounter the God that we find in Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Oliver. There's certainly a lot more to think about there. And I hope that some of the things that Oliver's been talking about have encouraged you, that we can have confidence in some of these issues. And actually thinking theologically about these questions does change the way that we live and changes the way we relate to God and relate to one another. So I hope this has sparked some interesting conversations between you. Thanks for watching. See you later.